everyone. My name is Debbie Feinstein. I am with the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. I'm Chief of the Special Victims Division, and I am also the current chair of the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really glad to see so many people coming out kind of after work or in the evening to cover this serious topic. We have the chat open. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, so are my slides advancing, Smitha?
Yes, they are.
Okay, terrific. We have the chat open, and if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please don't hesitate to drop something in the chat, and Smitha will try to convey that to me. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to simultaneously respond. I've got 2 screens here, which is why I'm kind of looking up, and I apologize for that. I will do my best to look directly at the camera, you know, as we go through things. So as you know, tonight we are covering a topic: domestic violence red flags, strangulation, and other dangerous behavior. This is not a an easy topic to discuss, but it's an important topic to discuss to understand what are the lethality factors that are associated with domestic violence. What do we need to be on the lookout for ourselves, for our family members, and for our friends? As I indicated, please utilize the chat, and if you have any technical issues, if you could reach out to Smitha Varia, who is on the call. Thank you. So what are we going to be discussing tonight? The topics that we're going to cover is what is domestic violence. I'm going to kind of go through that relatively quickly. What is the prevalence of domestic violence? What are the signs? What are the high-risk lethality factors? And understanding how you can help. And lastly, identifying community resources. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, or other abusive behavior that's part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against the other. And it's really that systematic pattern of power and control that is the hallmark of intimate partner violence. One partner asserting control over the other partner and wanting to maintain that control during the course of the relationship and beyond. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the conversation tonight. So there are different kinds of domestic violence, as you're likely aware. There's physical abuse, which is physical force, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, non-physical behaviors, including threats or insults. It also includes things like isolation, humiliation. One of the big issues with power and control is isolating an individual who is being victimized so that they really don't have anyone to reach out to, that they have to rely on the abuser. Sexual abuse, any action that pressures or coerces someone into doing something that sexually that they don't want to do. Sexual abuse also includes things like restricting access to birth control and restricting choices around sexual activity. Technological abuse, the use of technology or other social media to intimidate, harass, or threaten current or ex-dating partner, demanding passwords, excessive or threatening text, repeated text, stalking, utilizing these types of platforms to really intimidate, harass, follow someone, demanding someone give you access to, find my iPhone so they can follow you at all times, that sort of thing. Financial abuse, using money to have control, gift giving with strings attached, or setting up a partner to be dependent on the other partner. Or demanding, that the victim spend all sorts of money. For example, if you don't spend this money on me, if you don't take me to nice things, and you don't do this, that, and the other for me, you're worthless. What are you good for anyway? Why am I with you? Like that kind of a thing. Stalking is being repeatedly watched, followed, monitored, or harassed, and it can occur online or in person, and or may not include giving unwanted gifts. But we often think about stalking as that sort of following someone around. But stalking, particularly with the advent of the online world, really can be pursued and done online, in person, in lots of different ways. It can be through letter writing, it can be through emails, it can be through, as I was talking about before, sort of spyware or following someone through technology. So what are we talking about? Approximately 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate or dating partner. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced a rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner. These are incredibly high numbers. Within the LGBTQA plus community, 43.8% of lesbian women and 61.1% of bisexual women have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime, as opposed to that 1 in 3 of heterosexual women. 26% of gay men and 37.3% of bisexual men have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner, as compared to 29% of heterosexual men, the 1 in 4 number. Transgender victims are more likely to experience intimate partner violence in public. Bisexual victims are more likely to experience sexual violence compared to people who do not identify as bisexual. I want to note that I have citations at the end of this presentation, which we can drop in the chat if you're interested in reading more about any of the topics that I cover this evening. So what's going on locally? In 2020, there were 41 men and women that were killed in domestic violence homicides. And this is a significant number. The numbers unfortunately have been pretty consistent over the last number of years, but 41 victim deaths directly related to domestic violence, and these are victim deaths and that occurred. Approximately 702 victims received services in one day. In 2019, this was based on the census that was done just to try to sort of capture a moment in time and figure out how many individuals in Maryland are seeking domestic violence services in the course of a day. What are we seeing with respect to those deaths? Well, in 2020, the 41 victim deaths, I broke down some stats from the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. 75% were caused by a gun, 14% by blunt force trauma, 5 by stabbing, it's 5 by stabbing, and I believe 4% by strangulation. I apologize for the error on the slide, and 2% by stabbing and blunt force trauma. In Montgomery County, in 2020, there were 3 victim deaths, and to date in 2021, there have been 3. Again, victims of domestic violent intimate partner homicide. I looked up some stats on final protective orders. These are not just people that seek protective orders, but these are actually the protective orders that were granted in Montgomery County from October 2020 to September of 2021. And there were approximately 2,800 final protective orders that were granted from October 2020 and to September 2021. And these only include the protective orders. These only include if you qualify for protective order, which are specific categories, including intimate partner violence. But it requires that someone have a sexual relationship within the past 12 months in order to qualify, as well as being a family member or living with someone or being, co-parenting, having children together, that kind of thing. There's a specific list of categories. It doesn't include things like neighbors and that sort of thing. That's a whole other category, but this is specifically related to sort of intimate partner violence and those that qualify for a protective order. My office prosecutes approximately 100 misdemeanor domestic violence cases a month. Right now with COVID, we have about 25 a week that are set on our dockets. Pre-COVID, it was a lot more than that, but now we have staggered dockets, so the cases are spaced out more. And this is just in the district court for Montgomery County. Over 1,700 clients were served last year at the Family Justice Center, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Family Justice Center as we go through. So I want to talk for a moment about the signs that we can look for when we're concerned about someone, or just in general, as we're trying to identify what does abuse look like. The thing with domestic violence, as many of you may know, is that the person that has experienced the domestic violence, in all likelihood, is not going to want anyone to know what's going on in their home or in their relationship. There's a lot of shame associated with it. The numbers that we see, the 1 in 3 and the 1 in 4, that compared to the number of people that actually report what's going on, there's a huge discrepancy, because the individuals that actually talk about what happens or share what happens to them, those numbers are much lower. So what are the things that we can look for with our friends and family? Unusual absences or lateness, sudden or sustained drop in productivity, someone that's constantly worried about upsetting their partner, receiving multiple demanding calls or texts, as I was talking about before with technological abuse, someone that is sort of seems to have become more isolated, introverted, more unusually quiet, isn't doing the kinds of things that they had been doing before, isn't coming to the same clubs, isn't signing on to the same Zooms, isn't engaged in their child's school anymore, isn't coming to book club, isn't participating in, going to the gym or whatever it was that they were maybe usually doing, or going out to dinner or meeting a friend, or, going to happy hour, whatever it was. But if their behavior is changing and they seem to be more isolated, or quiet, or not willing to share what's going on, these are things that we can look for. Unexplained or poorly explained injuries, minimizing harassment or injuries. Someone that may become more sensitive about their home life, apologizes or excuses for their partner's behavior, and as I was describing, kind of stops doing enjoyable things, and really is becoming more isolated into themselves. That can be a big red flag. What are some of the signs that we can look for with abusers? Someone that's constantly checking their partner's cell phone, emails, or social media without permission. Someone that displays extreme jealousy, insecurity, or mood swings. They constantly demean their partner. Might have an explosive temper, make false accusations, tell a partner what to do, what to wear, who to be with. I remember a case that I prosecuted where the perpetrator, it was the perpetrator and the victim, he was the primary source of their income, and he would leave her an allowance on the top of the toilet seat once a week for what she could spend. Basically, this is the money that you have that you can spend this week. He would go with her when she would shop for clothing. He would have to approve everything. She would have to try it on for him. Ultimately, things got very violent between the two of them on one particular day, which brought the case to my office. But these were signs along the way that she really hadn't recognized as things that were, concerning. But these were, dynamics of power and control. And when things began to spin out of control for him, they were having some financial issues. The relationship turned violence. He used violence against her. So that's kind of an example of a sign of an abuser. The isolation piece that we already described, the physical violence, possessive behavior, or pressuring a partner into having sexual relations. So that's kind of some background on domestic violence and some of the general signs to look for. This webinar tonight, we are focusing really on what is the high risk lethality behavior. And these are things that are hard to talk about and hard to kind of get the word out on. For those of you that are familiar, you might have seen, I hope you've seen, we have some bus campaigns running right now, that are you feel unsafe at home, free help is available. And confidential services are available through the Family Justice Center, through the Crisis Center, Abused Persons Program, different programs. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But, we struggle with how do you get these high lethality behavior, these huge red flags? How do we get this information out to the community? We can't really put these on a bus, I don't think, or hand out flyers in the supermarket that says, if you check one of these boxes, you're at high risk of homicide. I mean, that is a really challenging thing to get the word out about, and it's not a comfortable topic. It's not one that, people, want to talk about on a day-to-day basis, but it's super important that we recognize what these red flags are. And I would welcome if you all have thoughts in the chat as to how we can spread this words on any of the information that I'm sharing tonight. We'd so appreciate your input. And that's one of the biggest things that we talk about in the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, which is the collective, collaborative body that is sponsoring these events for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, including this webinar tonight. The Domestic Violence Coordinating Council is a collaborative of government agencies, nonprofits, community members, and others that are dedicated to diminishing domestic violence in our community in Montgomery County. And this is one of the things that we talk about. How do we get the word out about these very, very serious behaviors that are highly correlated with homicide? So I've listed some here, and I'm going to go through each one. And talk about them. And again, if you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, please drop them in the chat. I'm actually, again, I keep looking up and I see myself looking up, but I have the chat open, and we'll try to respond to questions in real time. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop those in the chat. So the first high risk lethality behavior that I want to talk about is prior threats to kill an intimate partner or an intimate partner's children's or shared children or other family members. This is a huge lethality factor. I mean, it seems kind of intuitive. It seems kind of obvious. Well, if you threatened to kill someone before, then your risk would go up. Yes, that one is fairly intuitive because if there are prior threats to kill, that's going to be an incredibly strong risk factor. It can consistently link to murder of an intimate partner. I've seen a lot of cases where there have been no prior threats, and then there is a homicide. But in many cases and in many situations, there's some evidence of a prior threat or of a prior protective order or of some history. Even if it hadn't been reported to anyone, when we dive deeper and we try to learn a little bit more about what had happened, we can identify that there are some prior threats, prior controlling behavior, that sort of thing. Not only just direct threats, but expressing ideas or dreams or fantasies. This is also a risk factor, not only to, not only fantasies about killing their intimate partner, children, or relatives, but also themselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The risk becomes even greater if the abuser is specific about their plans or their intended methods. And an increase in how often the threats occur also can indicate greater risk. So these are all things to think about. Again, seems somewhat intuitive, pretty intuitive, I would say. If there are threats of violence, that we should take them seriously. But, again, when we have something in Montgomery County called the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team, and when we dive into some of these cases and look at history and look at the factors that were present, oftentimes someone has been, there's been threats to kill that either, maybe they say it comes in a heated moment. So, maybe I'm not going to feel like they actually would kill me. Or they may have shared this information with a family member or a friend that there were these threats out there, and the family member or friend either didn't know how to respond, didn't respond, or sort of didn't reach out and try to connect the person that was being threatened with some help or some support. So I think there's a lot of things to look out for, and it can be a little bit more complicated than sort of the obvious. If there are threats, there's this link, yes, and we need to take the threat seriously. And if you hear of anything like this, then sort of connect the dots and help the person that's being threatened to the extent that you can. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Similarly, weapon use or threats of weapon use or access to weapons or guns. This is a strong indicator of homicide risk. As I indicated a few moments ago, the vast majority of homicides in Maryland last year, 75% were committed with a firearm. So this is a huge, huge red flag. Having firearms in the house or having access to firearms is a huge indicator of homicide risk. Firearms more than anything else. Strangulation. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about strangulation, not only in terms of the lethality factors, which are incredibly high, but also what is it? What are we seeing? What are the signs that can be observed with respect to strangulation? And what are the things that we're concerned about with respect to strangulation? So let's talk about that for a few minutes. So first, and this is a really striking statistic. And there was a study that was done, again, have the citations at the end of the presentation, but there was a study that was done that looked at sort of the risks of homicide after someone has been strangled. So if someone has been previously strangled, the likelihood that they're going to be killed increases by 750%. Again, it's a startling, huge figure, but really strangulation is one of the highest risk factors. And this is actually, frankly, across the board. It's not only cases that involve intimate partner violence. There have been studies out there that look at individuals who commit sort of these mass acts of violence or acts of violence against law enforcement. Is a huge correlation between those individuals, the people that perpetrate these sort of mass acts of violence, these mass shootings, and there's a history of strangulation in many of these cases. There have been articles that have been written about it, newspapers that have covered it. It's really striking. Strangulation is a significant power and control move, right? You're cutting off someone's ability to breathe. Strangulation is often used as a tool of power and control because, look, I can kill you. I can put my hand around your neck, or I can tie something around your neck, or I can, press down on your neck or on your chest, cut off your airway, cut off your ability to breathe, cut off your blood flow, and I can kill you. And it will only take a short period of time. I want to distinguish between strangulation and choking. These are two things that are two terms that are often used interchangeably. Strangulation is the external application of pressure. Choking is when you have something internal, that is caught in your airway, if you will, food or whatever, or in sort of in a horrible way, if someone wanted to kill someone by shoving somebody down their throat. That's different than strangulation. Strangulation is that external application of pressure, and it can be strangulation can be accomplished by arterial or jugular compression. So what does that mean? Arterial is like what we think of as like the carotid artery, which is inside our neck, compression on the trachea, which is one of the what goes down the center of our neck. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, but or a medical professional. But these are things again that we can kind of think of intuitively, sort of stopping the brain from getting oxygen, cutting off our ability to breathe through our mouth or through our nose by cutting off that airflow. There's also jugular compression, which stops the blood from properly flowing out of the brain. And the interesting thing about jugular compression is that oftentimes people won't even feel like they can't breathe. They just start to feel woozy, or that they're not, basically like you're not getting enough blood to your brain anymore because the oxygenated blood is not flowing out of your brain at the proper rate, and it again can lead to death. Strangulation can be manual or it can be ligature. And what do I mean by that? It can be accomplished with someone's hands, or it can be accomplished with something else. I've had a case where the perpetrator used a pair of jeans to accomplish a ligature compression, an arterial compression around the victim's neck. And I've had cases where people have used wire, phone cords, rope. I mean, all different kinds of things can be utilized to, basically tie off someone's ability to breathe or prevent someone's blood from flowing properly. Another thing about strangulation that makes it so particularly dangerous is that a minimal amount of pressure can cause death. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what do I mean by a minimal amount of pressure? So unconsciousness from carotid or arterial compression is 5.5 to 22 pounds for as little as 10 seconds. Unconsciousness from jugular compression, 4.4 pounds of pressure for 15 to 30 seconds. So what does this mean in real life? How do we sort of correlate this? I read some interesting, sort of comparisons. A firm handshake is approximately 80 pounds of pressure. So much more than that 5.2 to 22 pounds or 4.4 pounds of pressure. These are minimal amounts compared to even a firm handshake. Opening a new jar of pickles takes approximately 20 pounds of pressure. Think about that. How much less pressure it takes to cause unconsciousness, or in the case of sort of that upper end number for arterial compression, it's around the same amount that it would take to open a new jar of pickles. I also have heard people talk about the fact that it's less pressure to strangle someone than it is to pop open a can of soda with your fingers. And again, we think about those as being kind of minimal amounts of pressure. It does not take a lot of pressure to render someone unconscious and to kill someone, which is again, what makes strangulation such an unfortunate and effective and lethal tool. So this is a little bit hard to read, but again, you can link to some of the citations at the end, and again, I will drop those in the chat before we conclude this evening, the citations. But this sort of timeline really demonstrates how quickly someone can die as a result of strangulation. Pressure is applied on the carotid artery, so this is the arterial compression. Someone can go unconscious in 6.8 seconds. It's a 5 to 10 second range that someone can be rendered unconscious. 14 seconds, someone could have a seizure. Within 15 seconds, at a minimum, someone could lose bladder control. 30 seconds, lose bowel control. And then death can occur as soon as 62 seconds, according to this one study. We have cases where we learn that someone has been has lost bladder control, and the loss of bladder control or the loss of bowel control, you're within seconds of being killed. The person is within seconds of being killed, and these are huge risk factors and huge things to look at, and things that are just not well known. There is a question in the chat that says, I actually am not seeing it. Let's see if I can.
It's in the Q&A.
Oh, in the Q&A, that's not what I have open. Okay, there you go. There we go. Okay, I see it. Thank you. The question is domestic violence usually or always associated with mental illness? So I am not a mental health professional, but based on sort of my experience as a prosecutor, no. I mean, I think mental illness can play a role. And I think it also depends on the way that you define or describe mental illness. It is a power and control dynamic, not necessarily a mental illness. I don't know, Smita, if you have any other thoughts on that, or if you want to add anything on that, but that's my simple answer is, if the question is it usually or always associated? No, not usually and not always associated with mental illness, unfortunately. But there is a correlation, and we certainly see individuals who are mentally ill perpetrate acts of domestic violence, but it's a different dynamic than the power and control dynamic. Smita, do you have anything that you want to add on that?
No, I think that was right. Just as Debbie had said, it's there can be people with mental health or mental illness who perpetrate domestic violence, but that is definitely not always or in the majority of the cases.
You know, interestingly, so when a perpetrator is screened for counseling, we have an abuser intervention program in Montgomery County called the Abused Persons Program, and there are two screens that are done initially. One is for substance abuse, and one is for mental health issues, and so those issues can be addressed, and oftentimes first before they can do the abuser intervention program. I don't know the statistics around how many people sort of screen into needing mental health issues. Or having mental health issues. But again, my experience based on the cases that I've handled unfortunately hundreds over the course of my career. You know, I would not say that it's often or always at all, unfortunately. I mean, there's just a level of depravity and power and control that is sort of attenuated from what we think of as classic mental illness. So this is just a different way of looking at the statistics that I was talking about before. Death from the arterial occlusion, or the cutoff of breath, can occur within 15 to 30 seconds, and venous occlusion, the cutoff of the blood flow, can occur within 4 minutes. So those are some of the additional statistics or information. So this is a kind of a tiny diagram. Again, you know, I try not to put too many things that are, you know, too dense or difficult to look at in that PowerPoint, but I'm showing you this because as a reminder that there's a lot more information out there. This is on the website for the Strangulation Prevention Institute that I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about non-fatal strangulation, to go check it out. So what are some of the typical signs and symptoms of strangulation? There can be neurological changes, and one of these can exist in isolation. There may be more than one. There may be no external signs at all, no visible signs of injury. In fact, there are visible signs of injury in less than 50% of non-fatal strangulation cases. Or actually of strangulation cases in general, less than 50% of those cases have any external visible injury, and it doesn't mean that the person is not at great risk of a serious medical condition like stroke, or seizure, or other neurological conditions, or other serious medical conditions that can lead to death. You know, we've had cases where someone's there's compression of the carotid artery, and it didn't result in a closing off of the airway initially, but it wasn't. I've seen cases where it wasn't initially identified that there was an injury there, and then the person later died because the carotid artery, again, I'm not using exactly the right terms, I'm not a medical professional, but basically the internal structure just collapsed, and the person then wasn't able to breathe and died. And I've definitely seen that before in cases, and it's horrible. And again, that person had no external visible injuries at all, which is often a misunderstood thing with respect to strangulation. So there can be neurological changes. Oftentimes when someone is responding to a scene of domestic violence, when law enforcement or fire and rescue are responding, you may have they may encounter a victim that is unable to recall exactly what happened, maybe slow in their speech, may have some cognitive distortion, and this is all results and symptoms of strangulation and having that loss of their ability to breathe, or the loss of blood flow. Because it's impacting them neurologically. And this is something that we've worked with the police department on training around. Well, how does strangulation impact the brain? You know, you know, why is someone having difficulty speaking, swallowing? They may faint, they may feel dizzy. And why is documenting those particular symptoms so important, and also so important to encourage medical treatment, even if you don't see any external signs of injury? Now, there may be injury to the eyes or to the eyelids. There could be something called petechiae, which are sort of these pinpoint dots that we often see, little red dots, which are associated with cutting off of the ability to breathe, or the cutting off of blood flow. And you can see them in the eyes, you can see them around the eyes. Actually, you can see them in the mouth, you can see them on the chest, but that's another visual sign. There's also can be injuries to someone's scalp. As I was mentioning, voice and throat changes. There may be breathing changes. You may see sort of things that may be more obvious: scratch marks, finger marks, imprints on the neck, the chest. One of the things that we've worked on, again, doing education around this issue, is making sure that law enforcement and fire and rescue are checking the back of someone's neck, because there may not be marks on the front. There may be marks in or around someone's ears, you know, based on the way that someone was grabbing someone else. You know, the perpetrator was grabbing the victim. So these are all things to look for. There also could be petechiae on the earlobes. There could be bleeding in the ears as a result. You know, we often, or not often, but we sometimes see situations where someone's had hair pulled out during the course of a strangulation incident, and certainly during the course of assault. But these are things to look for. Someone that may be coughing, maybe feeling nauseous, may have a sore throat, or nauseated, may have a sore throat, maybe clearing their throat often. These are all things that are symptomatic of strangulation, that is, again, some intuitive, some are not intuitive. And that's why it's so important for people to understand that if their airway has been cut off, or if they've, you know, if they've been strangled, that needs medical attention. And even if they don't, you know, feel worse for the wear afterwards, but it's still a medical professional should check someone out, because there could be an underlying life-threatening condition that is not apparent to the naked eye. I mentioned this before, that urinary incontinence is a sign that person is within seconds of death. And even if the victim doesn't necessarily remember that they've experienced a loss of consciousness, if they've gotten to the point where they've lost control of their urine, that they are in a situation where they're likely experienced a loss of consciousness, even if they don't remember it. You know, and this is something, again, that is common when first responders are, you know, see individuals immediately after a strangulation incident or episode. And as I was mentioning, lack of visible findings does not equate to lack of a serious or life-threatening condition. Only half of victims have visible injuries, and then only about 15% can be photographed, which again makes this kind of challenging when you're looking to prosecute a case, or having members of the community understand that this incident occurred, even if they can't see anything, even if something couldn't be photo documented. And that's why, again, it's so important to get this information out about how strangulation, non-fatal strangulation, manifests itself. So that really concludes what I was going to speak about with respect to strangulation. Before I move on, I want to mention a couple of other things that I think it's important for the community to know. My office and the Family Justice Center and others have worked really closely, and our Director of Forensic Medical Nursing at Shady Grove have worked really closely with the police department to develop specific documentation when they respond to a 911 call for domestic violence, specific documentation around non-fatal strangulation. So in 2020, that documentation rolled out. So what we've been seeing is much better documentation and many more questions being asked, so that this information can be documented. And it has made a huge difference in our ability to hold offenders accountable, and also, more importantly, to talk about sort of safety and health consequences from strangulation. There are handouts that the police have that they, you know, can give to individuals that have been, that have been strangled, so they can learn more about what these factors are. But, you know, so many things are at play when someone is a victim of domestic violence, that it may not be safe for them to follow up, or to take literature, or to say that they don't feel well. So there's many different factors at play, but our police have become a lot more educated on this. If you may have seen and read, there have been some recent articles in the news and on WTOP about the increase in severity of domestic violence, strangulation incidents. And think part of that is because we're finding out more when strangulation occurs, because the police are asking more questions, first responders are asking more questions, people are becoming more aware of what this is and what this looks like. And again, that's going to lead to hopefully better outcomes for the victim and for the victim's health and safety and security. So that's really important change. One of the other really important changes that has happened is that that on October 1st, 2020, Maryland finally implemented, Maryland became, I think we're like the 48th or 49th state to make strangulation a delineated felony. What does that mean? So when we prosecute assault cases, there are different levels of assault. A second-degree assault is an unconsented to touching, and a first-degree assault is, and that's sort of a very generalized definition. It's a physical, act against someone else. For the second-degree assault, a first-degree assault, which is the felony, which is a higher penalty, higher consequences, is a crime of violence. Is it's not only is there the unconsented to touching, but you also have to have previously you had to have a serious physical injury, you had to have a threat of death, or a protracted injury, something that lasted. So even a broken bone may not have been enough because it could heal, or a use of a gun. The use of a gun is always a first-degree assault in Maryland, and we worked really hard in Maryland's legislature to make strangulation a delineated felony, so that if one person strangles another, and airflow or blood flow is cut off, then we have a much clearer path to charging someone with a much more serious crime, which is appropriate given all that we've just discussed about the high risk and high correlation to homicide that strangulation has. So we're fortunate in Maryland that this finally happened. Again, we're like the 48th or 49th state to actually implement this. We were way at the end, but we finally did it, and it's really been a game changer for the way that we're able to prosecute these cases and hold offenders accountable for the serious nature of what they did. So what are some other high-risk lethality behaviors? Separation. One of the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship is when a victim decides to leave, because the abuser is losing power. And so the danger to the victim greatly increases. And, the Family Justice Center, the Abused Persons Program, has a lot of support and safety planning for victims around, or for individuals that are, experiencing domestic violence around this moment in time when someone is going to separate, when someone wants to leave, when someone wants to move out. It can be an incredibly dangerous time. We see a high correlation between individuals who are, breaking up with a partner, and then that partner coming and either trying or succeeding in killing them. I had a case a few years ago where a young woman, she's in a graduate program at the University of Maryland. She met this guy online. They started dating, and he eventually started to display very controlling behaviors. Was sending her, tons of messages, always wanted to know where she was, what she was up to. Eventually, she just said, I'm done with the relationship. We're over. Basically, this is not for me. He said, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you one last time. Please meet up with me. And she said, I'll meet up with you in a public place. She talked to a friend before she went. And she said, I'm going to go meet up with him in this public place. It was in the Target parking lot in Germantown. And he brought a gun, and he shot and killed her in that parking lot over the separation, over the fact that she had left him. It was horrifying and terrible. And she, kind of did everything right. In terms of, telling the friend that she was going, leaving, telling, meeting in the public place, that kind of thing. But it was still an incredibly dangerous situation that she may not have understood the real danger that she was under. Certainly I think this is an important lethality factor that we have to recognize. Suicidality or depression. With depression, the risk of serious assault or homicide increases. It's found to be a factor in a study that was completed on incidents of murder-suicide. In addition to the 41, the 41 victim deaths in 2020, in Maryland, there were 11 additional deaths threats of the offender, of the perpetrator, when they killed themselves after killing their intimate partner. So I guess, amending what I had said earlier, maybe not amending, but yes, depression can be a factor, but depression is, again, it is a piece of it, but it is not, again, in my experience and what I've seen, sort of the driving force. The power and control dynamic is more of the driving force. And in fact, we've seen a number of cases of intimate partner homicide where the perpetrator actually has ended up killing themselves in prison after they've been convicted of a domestic violence death. And I don't know, I mean, again, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm just saying this kind of anecdotally. It seems to me that when we see these suicides, a lot of it is still about power and control. It's controlling their own death in light of what, what they had done to someone else. And actually, I just heard on the news today, it sounds like they may have discovered the remains of the perpetrator in the Ashley Petito case, which was a strangulation case. This is the case with the young woman and her fiance that were traveling through the country, and he came home and she did not. And then she was later discovered dead. And the cause of death was strangulation. And I heard, again, just today on the radio as I was driving home, that they think they found his remains, and it's looking like a suicide that he committed. So again, there's a huge correlation and link. And threats of suicide, again, as part of the power and control, trying to assert control over someone else, are also a factor. Stalking is another huge lethality risk factor. Just some quick statistics, 76% of female homicide victims by intimate partner perpetrators had at least one episode of stalking in the year prior. 89% of female victims who were physically assaulted were also stalked in the 12 months before the murder. So these are individuals that had a prior physical assault. There was also stalking, and then they were murdered. 79% of abused female homicide victims reported being stalked in the same period that they were abused, sort of a different take on the same situation. 54% of female homicide victims had reported stalking to the police before they were killed by their stalkers. So again, very concerning statistics. And sorry about that. So stalking is something that, we, again, try to get a lot of information out about. It can be, as I described in the beginning, it can be by email, it can be in person, it can be essentially designed. It's not only designed or threats to harm, it also can be designed to commit emotion, to cause the person to be in emotional distress. That's another way that stalking can be accomplished in Maryland and is criminalized. So there's lots of different ways, but again, it's a power and control dynamic that is hugely associated with lethality. So I was talking before about some of the documentation that the police use, and I want to also show you this document. Again, it's kind of small, but just to sort of flagging for me and reminding for me what's in this. This is called the domestic violence lethality screen. It's something that the police use on the scene with victims of domestic violence and go through and ask a number of questions. And depending on the number of answers that are given that are yes, it either screens in the victim to a protocol or it does not. Well, and the officer can always refer someone and can screen in for the protocol. The protocol is that the officer makes a call to, in this case, to the crisis center, so that someone can speak, so that the victim on the scene can speak to someone about what's going on, if they're willing to, or at least be able to get the information that they might need or want in order to safety plan. So some of the questions are exactly what we talked about tonight so far. Has he or she ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Has he or she threatened to kill you or your children? Do you think he or she might try to kill you? Those are automatic screen-ins to the lethality high-risk protocol. And if there's no yeses to those first three questions, but there's at least 4 yeses to the following questions, then there's still a screen-in. And again, the person completing the lethality screen can always recommend a screen-in regardless of what the answers are. But these are the additional questions. Does he or she have a gun, or can they get one easily? Have they ever tried to choke you? The word choke is used on the screen because it's a more colloquial, more familiar word than strangulation. So that word choke is deliberately put there. This is, again, by someone that had studied this issue, and this is actually someone in Maryland, her name is Jackie Campbell, that studied it, has written a ton of articles on the topic of lethality. I have some of her stuff in the citations, and it's now used this lethality screen throughout the country. The next question is, has he or she violently or is he or she violently or constantly jealous, or does he or she control most of your daily activities? Have you left him or her or separated after living together or being married? Is he or she unemployed? Has he or she ever tried to kill his or herself? Do you have a child that he or she knows is not hers or his? Does he or she follow you, spy on you, or ever leave threatening messages? So those are some of the other questions, again, similar to, and then as what we've been discussing, for the rest of this evening. This screen is not only used by the police, but it's also used by medical providers, by service providers, as a way to sort of understand what is the risk that this person is facing and what information might they need, and how can we safety plan based on what we know from this lethality screen. So one of the things that often comes up with situations involving intimate partner violence is, the victim of domestic violence may not leave, despite the lethality factors, despite the concerns. They may not leave their abuser, or they may try to protect their abuser. We see that all the time in cases that come to trial that my office handles, where someone calls the police for help, but by the time we get to trial, the dynamic has shifted, and they are trying to protect the person that abused them, and that can be for a variety of reasons. And I'm going to talk about some of those reasons. And one of the most important things that we think about in my office, and I know that service providers and others that work with victims of domestic violence, is there's really no blame to go around here. Someone, I could never walk in this person's shoes, and there are so many factors that are impacting a victim of domestic violence. Whether they choose to participate in a criminal case is just a minor piece of it. It may not be safe for them to do it. They may rely on someone financially. They may be relying on the perpetrator's, promises to stop or change. They may be afraid of losing custody of their kids, losing their house. They're in love with the perpetrator. They're afraid of being alone. Or they've been so isolated that they don't have anyone anymore to go to and to talk to. They have no support system. They've been isolated from their family. Threats of harm to themselves, have threats of harm to themselves, or threats of harm by the other person towards them, that they've been threatened, essentially, is really what that means. They're afraid about their reputation. They're ashamed. They might be embarrassed. We didn't really talk about this yet tonight, but you may already know that domestic violence really cuts across all socioeconomic, race, religion, any type of sort of category that divides us. Domestic violence unites us. The statistics are the same regardless of race, socioeconomic background, religion, and that sort of thing. With the exception, as I talked earlier, the statistics unfortunately are more significant for LGBTQA plus individuals. The risks and the numbers of individuals that are impacted by domestic violence is actually higher. Safety issues, concern about escalation. I call the police, or if someone gets involved, and and law enforcement gets involved, and the person gets out of jail, and they're just going to come back and hurt me. So thank you to the individual that's attending that also says culture. Yes, absolutely, across cultures. Really across any, I don't want to say category, that's not the right word, but anything, as I said, anything that any difference that humans may have from one another, domestic violence doesn't care about any of those differences or any of those communities or anything. It's all the same. The reporting numbers may be different. I think, again, this is more anecdotal than statistical or analytical. But what I've seen is that individuals who that live in homes where they're, where it's an apartment, let's say, for example, I think we see more reports there because other people can hear what's going on. Someone that lives in a single family home may be easier to hide what is going on because their neighbor can't hear it and call 911. So I think that there may be differences in reporting levels depending on, different factors, but certainly not with the amount that it is happening, if that makes sense. So how can you help? Listen, offer your support, be patient. Don't criticize or tell them what to do. Validate their feelings. One of the things that I learned early on is that when speaking to someone who's impacted by domestic violence, they're already under a situation where someone is trying to control them. They're already dealing with sort of that power control dynamic. And the thing not to say is, gosh, why don't you just leave? You know, you should leave, do this, do that. That is exactly what we shouldn't do when we're, you know, talking to a friend or family member that may be impacted by domestic violence. Really, we need to be there to listen, to support the person, not tell him or her what to do, and to validate their feelings, and try to help them get to resources. So what can you say? I'm concerned for your safety. No one deserves to be harmed. There are organizations that can help, and be armed and ready with that information, or sit down with them, Google it, you know, find it together. I'm here to help whenever you are ready and with whatever you might need. I will go with you. I will hold your hand. You know, you can stay with me, you know, whatever it is that you can offer, to offer that to the person that may be impacted. So safety planning, these are just a couple of, you know, quick notes. It's more complex than I put here, and the Family Justice Center is certainly available and open and specializes in helping victims of domestic violence plan for their safety, as well as the Crisis Center and the Abused Persons Program. But I mentioned before that the most dangerous time is when someone tries to leave, so it's really important to consider that factor in safety planning. Encouraging your friend or family member to reach out to victim service providers like the ones that I've mentioned, offer to provide transportation or go with them. If you feel like someone's in immediate danger, to contact 911. If you're concerned that an older adult may not have the cognitive capacity to make decisions due to dementia or another medical condition, consider reaching out to Adult Protective Services or working with healthcare providers. There may be other factors that play there as well. Educate others, talk about the statistics, host educational programs, promote community resources. If anyone that's joined this presentation tonight is interested in having a similar presentation or any other topic related to domestic violence, prevention and education, if you are interested in bringing that type of presentation to your community groups, to your church, mosque, synagogue, whatever, wherever, we're willing and stand at the ready to do that. Promote community resources. We have family prevention cards. I was describing what's on the buses. We also have cards that can be handed out. And if you're interested in getting some of those cards to distribute to your community organizations, to leaving them at your haircut place, your doctor's office, your dentist's office, the library, wherever that you think might be helpful for someone to see them, we can send that out as well. So I mentioned the Montgomery County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. I'd encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, whatever your choice is. Also to check out the Family Justice Center website. And I mentioned the Family Justice Center, the Crisis Center. We also are lucky to have the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse that serves residents in Montgomery County. And I would encourage everyone to be familiar with those resources. I'm going to take a quick minute just to talk about the fact that the DVCC also has programs for teens. And I would encourage you to go to our website and check it out. We do programs in health classrooms, for Girl Scout troops, for athletic teams, for really anyone that wants us to come and do programming, because education and prevention can start early. And unfortunately, the statistics are not great with respect to teens either. So here are the citations that I promised. Smitha, I don't know if you're able to cut and paste them out and put them into the chat for folks so that they can see them, or probably more appropriate is that if you want this information, send an email, fill out the form that Smitha is showing you in the chat, and we can send you follow-up information. Or you can take a picture of the screen. I'll leave it up for a second. But again, my name is Debbie Feinstein. I'm with the State's Attorney's Office. I have the privilege of chairing the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, and have been really engaged in issues related to education and prevention. It's I think a lot about the fact that, and I was describing how I see a lot of cases that come through our office, and that's unfortunately most of the time after something horrible has happened or something bad has happened. And I think it's really my privilege and honor to have the opportunity to try to get out in front of the issue. And we're willing to go far and wide and speak to as many community groups as will have us about this subject matter. So this is my contact information, debbie.feinstein@montgomerycountymd.gov. And here's some information about Domestic Violence Awareness Month and some additional upcoming programs. I see another question. Do I have any knowledge of a light that's used to evaluate strangling? Let me answer that. yeah, there's an alternate light source. Unfortunately, it's not something that we can use in court. There's cameras, and they do utilize them at the hospital, and but they're not something that can be used in court at this point. But they can be used as a evaluation tool. Yes, there is an alternative light source device. It's a camera that our forensic medical unit at Shady Grove has and does utilize for that purpose. The other question is, I focus on intimate partner violence. What about young adult children abusing? I'm not sure who. Young adult children abusing, maybe the older adult or a parent. Again, I'm not sure exactly what the full question is there. Parent abusing parents. That is a whole separate presentation. My division at the State's Attorney's Office also prosecutes elder and vulnerable adult abuse, and there's a whole separate presentation and conversation that we could have about that. You know, some of the risk factors are the same and some are different. And happy to have a longer conversation if you want to follow up with Smitha about setting up a time to have a presentation on that as well. I'm going to take down the slides now. Smitha's been putting information in the chat that I would encourage you to follow up on. Is there anything else in there that I should be taking a look at, Smitha? Q&A. How do I think COVID-19 has impacted domestic violence? COVID-19 has absolutely impacted domestic violence. I mean, I think particularly early on in the pandemic, because everyone was you know, quarantining or isolating at home, domestic violence was happening behind closed doors, and people weren't sort of seeing the normal people that they would see, or going to the normal professionals, or going to work, or, you know, going to the doctor even. And so, yeah, absolutely, it's impacted domestic violence. I think the stressors involved with it, the financial issues that have come out of COVID-19, absolutely contribute to domestic violence. Now, as I was saying, we haven't seen, at least not in Montgomery County, we haven't seen an increased number of cases coming in, but we have seen an increase in the nature and severity of the cases that we have been seeing. There was a dip in the number of people that were accessing services, that were getting protective orders, in the cases that were charged during sort of those first few months when the pandemic hit. Thankfully, we've done a lot of, you know, education and prevention work out there trying to get the word out. And then as things began to open up, we saw reports coming in at a more regular and consistent pace. Lisa, did I miss any questions in the Q&A?
I just wanted to mention for the person that asked about older adult children and parents, Elder Safe, the organization, one of the organizations that works on elder abuse in Montgomery County, is also having a webinar on October 28th from 1 to 3 p.m. Understanding and reducing bullying among older adults. So the information for that webinar is also on the link that I provided for the DVAM schedule of events.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you, Smitha, for bringing that up. That's great. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out and follow up with us. We want to spread the word, you know, far and wide. And please, you know, so if you're willing to help distribute the cards, or if you want to get more involved, we have subcommittees with the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. We have our Teen Dating Violence Prevention Initiative, where we run all sorts of programs and are always looking for volunteers to help with that. So if you want to get more involved in the prevention aspects, you know, please reach out and let us know, and we'd be happy to get you engaged. I really thank you again for joining us this evening and for taking time out of your night to learn about this. Again, not easy subject to talk about, but a super important topic to talk about. So thank you, and thank you to Smitha for organizing and hosting, and to our Domestic Violence Awareness Month committee that really planned the events this month. So I hope everyone has a good evening, and if you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.